She walked past me at the funeral, my own daughter. Dark coat, red-rimmed eyes, jaw set the way it gets when she has made a decision and is not going to unmake it. She had not looked at me once all day, not during the service, not during the burial, not when the white lilies were placed and the photographs arranged, and 200 people said everything that people say when someone is gone. She walked past me, toward the exit. At the door, she stopped. She didn't turn around. She said, "You had one more option, Dad. One more thing you could have tried, and you didn't." I swallowed. She said, quietly, flatly, "The way you say something you have been carrying for a long time and have finally decided to put down, you're dead to me." The door swung shut behind her. Rain filled the silence. I looked down at what was in my hand. Eleanor's wedding ring, worn smooth by 52 years. I had been turning it between my thumb and forefinger since the graveside. I had buried my wife 3 hours earlier. Now I was burying something else. 6 months later, in a lawyer's office, with rain still falling outside the window, a man named Attorney David Reed placed a single sealed envelope in the center of the table. The paper was yellowed slightly, addressed in Eleanor's careful cursive. "To my family, read only when we are all together." Reed said, "Your wife asked that no one open this until today, until all of you were in the same room." He looked around the table, at me, at Susan, at the teenage girl beside her. He said, "She was very specific about that. The camera of memory holds on that envelope, rain against the glass. My name is Harold Bennett. I am 75 years old. I spent 31 years as a firefighter in this town, and the hardest fire I ever walked into was the quiet distance between myself and my daughter. This is how we found our way back. Late morning light through lace curtains, my kitchen, the modest ranch-style home where Eleanor and I lived for 31 years. The kind of house where every object has a story. The coffee maker gurgles. 2 mugs sit on the counter out of habit before I catch myself and put one back in the cabinet. I had spent 31 years as a firefighter in this town. I had walked into more burning houses than I can count, but nothing had prepared me for walking through the door of an empty one. I sat at the small kitchen table, a folded newspaper, untouched. On the wall behind me, a faded photograph of a young couple on their wedding day, Harold in an army uniform, Eleanor in a simple white dress, laughing at something just out of frame. I married Eleanor Whitfield in the spring of 1974. 52 years. 2 kids, 1 house. A life built slow and steady, the way I had been taught to build anything worth keeping. I reached for the second mug, out of habit. Froze. Quietly put it away. I moved to the recliner by the window. My chair, angled, out of old habit, so I could see hers. Eleanor's chair sat empty. The folded Afghan blanket, still draped over the arm, exactly where she left it. I have not moved it. Let me take you back 8 months. The hospital room. Eleanor propped against pillows, thin but bright-eyed. I sat beside her, holding her hand. The doctor stood at the foot of the bed with a folder. He said, "There's a trial in Cleveland, experimental. I want to be honest with you both. The success rate is low, and the treatment itself is brutal on a body already this weakened." Eleanor said, calm, squeezing my hand. "How low?" The doctor said, 12% respond. Of those, most gain months, not years. And the treatment itself carries real risk of hastening things. Eleanor looked at me. 50 years of understanding without needing words. She said to the doctor gently, "Thank you for being honest with us. Can we have a moment?" He nodded and left. She turned to me. She said, "Harold, look at me." I said, voice breaking, "I'll drive you to Cleveland every single day, if that's what you want." She said, "I know you would. That's not what I'm asking." She paused, gathering strength. She said, "I don't want to spend my last good months in a hospital bed, getting sicker for a 12% chance. I want to spend them with you. In our kitchen, in our yard. I want to sit in my chair and watch you pretend you're not crying at the news. A wet, broken laugh came out of me. She said, "Promise me you'll let me choose this. Promise me you won't let anyone, not even Susan, make you feel like you failed me for honoring what I wanted." I said, barely audible, "I promise." I had kept that promise. I just hadn't told anyone what the promise was. The phone rang. I looked at it a long moment. I answered. It was Susan, standing at her kitchen counter, exhausted, a family calendar crowded with appointments behind her, a teenager's backpack on a chair. She said, "It's me. I wanted to check if you'd eaten today." I said, "I'm fine, Susan." She said, "That's not what I asked." A pause. Neither of us spoke. The old wound sitting between us, like a third person on the line. I said, "I had toast." She said, "Dad." I said, "I'm fine." "Really?" Another silence. She closed her eyes. She said, "Okay, I'll call you later." She hung up first. I held the phone a moment longer, set it down gently, like it might break. We had not spoken about that day at the funeral home, not directly. Grief, it turned out, could make people orbit each other for months without ever touching down. That night I lay on my side of the bed, the other side untouched, the pillow still fluffed the way Eleanor liked it. Moonlight through the window. I reached over, not to the pillow, to the nightstand, where her photograph sat in a small frame, Eleanor at 60, laughing on a porch swing. I said, whispered, "I don't know how to do this part, Elle." I closed my eyes. Morning light slanted through a dusty window. I stood at my workbench, old firehouse habit, keeping my hands busy when my mind won't settle. I was sanding down a small wooden birdhouse, unfinished, half-built. Tools hung neatly on a pegboard behind me, each outlined in faded marker, the way a fire captain organizes a rig. I had not retired from fire service because I wanted to. I had retired because Eleanor asked me to. In 2019, after 31 years, she had sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, quietly, "Harold, I want more time with you than fire season allows. I'm asking you to come home." I came home. 2 years later, she was diagnosed. I had spent 2 years of full mornings in this garage, learning, finally, after 31 years of being needed elsewhere, what it felt like to be home. The birdhouse was hers. Her idea, she had said, the summer before the diagnosis, that the maple tree in the backyard needed a tenant, that a yard without birds was a yard that hadn't been properly introduced to itself. I had said I'd build one. I hadn't finished it before she got sick. I hadn't been able to finish it after. A car pulled into the driveway. I looked through the dusty window. A 15-year-old girl got out, backpack, sneakers, the particular walk of someone who has been sent somewhere and is not entirely sure of her welcome, but is coming anyway. Maddie, my granddaughter, Susan's daughter. She knocked on the side door of the garage. I opened it. She said, "Hi, Grandpa." I said, "Your mom know you're here." She said, "She knows I went out." I said, "That's not the same thing." She said, "No, but it's what I've got." She came in and looked at the birdhouse. She said, "You're still working on it." I said, "Working up to it." She picked up a piece of sandpaper from the workbench and, without asking, started sanding the side panel I had been avoiding. We worked in silence for a while. She said, "Eventually, she cries sometimes. At night, Mom, when she thinks I'm asleep." I said, "She lost her mother." She said, "She also lost you. She just doesn't know how to say that part." I kept sanding. She said, "Why don't you call her?" I said, "I've tried." She said, "Not like you mean it. She was 15. She was right." I said, "Your grandmother made me promise something." Maddie looked at me. I said, "She made me promise not to push the Cleveland trial on her, not to make her feel guilty for choosing her own way out. It was what she wanted, to come home and live the time she had left, not to spend it fighting a 12% chance in a hospital far from everything she loved. Maddie said, slowly, and Mom thinks you didn't try hard enough. I said, your mom doesn't know about the promise. Nobody does. Eleanor asked me to let the decision be hers, not to explain it or defend it. Just honor it, Maddie said. But that means Mom thinks. I said, yes. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Grandpa, that's not fair to you. I said, no, but it's what your grandmother asked for. And I spent 52 years not being sorry about the things Eleanor asked me for. In the weeks that followed, Maddie came back. Not every day, but often enough that I started making 2 cups of coffee again. One for me, one that might be needed. She helped me with the birdhouse. She was not particularly skilled with tools, but she had Eleanor's patience, the willingness to do a thing slowly until it was right. The birdhouse was finished on a Thursday afternoon in January. We hung it in the maple tree together. I held the ladder. She climbed it, which she did not need my permission for, but which I appreciated her accepting my steadying presence during. She said, from the branch level, Grandma would like this. I said, she picked the tree. She said, she picked everything good. I said, most of it. She climbed down. We stood back and looked at the birdhouse in the maple tree. She said, can I ask you something? I said, ask. She said, did you know about the letter from the lawyer? I said, Mr. Reed had been sending correspondence. I hadn't opened the letters yet. She said, why not? I said, because opening mail from your wife's attorney means it's real, that she made arrangements for after, and I wasn't ready for it to be that settled. Maddie said, you have to open them eventually. I said, I know. She said, Grandpa, I think whatever's in them, I think it might help. With Mom. I looked at the girl who was 15 and wiser than she had any right to be, and who had been the only one coming around for 6 months, and who had never once made me feel like the weight I was. I said, how's your mother? She said, angry, sad, guilty, I think. She doesn't say the guilty part, but you can tell. I said, guilt is just love with nowhere to land. She looked at me. I said, your grandmother said that. Once. About a different situation, but I think it applies. Maddie pulled out her phone. She said, I'm going to text her right now and tell her she needs to meet with Mr. Reed. Both of you. Together. I said, Maddie. She said, you're welcome. She typed. She sent it. The response from Susan came back in under a minute. Fine. Wednesday. Together. I looked at Maddie. She said, old people take forever when they're left to figure things out themselves. The law office of Marshall and Reed. A modest conference room, wood table, tall bookshelves, rain still falling outside the window. I sat on one side of the table, Susan on the other, Maddie beside her mother, which was either strategic or instinctive, and was probably both. Attorney Reed was 60-something, kind-eyed but formal. He placed the single sealed envelope in the center of the table. The paper yellowed slightly. Eleanor's careful cursive. To my family. Read only when we are all together. Reed said, your wife asked that no one open this until today, until all of you were in the same room. He looked at each of us. He said, she was very specific about that. Susan looked at the envelope, then at me, then away. I looked at the envelope. 52 years of Eleanor's handwriting on a single piece of paper. The specific, careful way she formed her letters. The way she always crossed her T's with a tiny upward flick. Reed said, with your permission, I'll read it aloud. She also asked that I read it rather than pass it around, so that you'd hear it together. Her words. Susan said quietly, okay. Reed opened the envelope with the specific, careful attention of someone who understands what he is holding. He began to read. His voice was formal at first, then softened. Eleanor's words. She wrote that she had asked Mr. Reed to prepare this letter 18 months before her death. that she had updated it twice as things became clearer. She wrote that she wanted to begin with Harold. Reed read, in Eleanor's voice, "Harold, my love, there are things I asked you to carry alone that I should not have asked you to carry alone. The promise about Cleveland, the choice I made about my treatment. I asked you to honor it, and then I asked you not to explain it, and that second part was unfair to you. I asked you to love me by being silent, when silence would cost you something I didn't have the right to take. I'm sorry for that. The choice was right for me. The cost of it to you. That is something I have sat with. You kept your promise. You always kept your promises. I am sorry that keeping this one meant carrying it alone." I sat very still. I had been a firefighter for 31 years. I had learned long ago how to hold myself together in front of others. I held myself together. Reed continued. Eleanor wrote that she wanted to speak to Susan. Reed read, "Susan, my girl, my first real accomplishment. I need to tell you something about your father that he will not tell you himself, because Harold has never been good at speaking in his own defense, and I have spent 52 years admiring and occasionally wanting to strangle him for exactly that quality. Your father applied to be fire chief in 1997. He was offered the position. He turned it down. He turned it down because you were 9 years old, and you were going through the hard year, the year I know you remember, and because he decided that his child needed him home more than the department needed him behind a desk. He never told you. He asked me not to tell you. He said you'd feel guilty, and feeling guilty about something that was his choice to make wasn't something he wanted for you. What I need you to understand, Susan, is that your father has been making those quiet choices your entire life. The ones that cost him something. The ones he doesn't talk about. The Cleveland trial was one of them. He sat across from that doctor with me, and he wanted to fight. I could see it in his hands. He was already making plans for the drive, the schedule, how he'd manage it. And then I asked him not to. I asked him to let me choose the ending I wanted. And he said yes, because he loved me more than he wanted to save me. Do you understand the difference? He loved me more than he wanted to save me. I do not want you to be angry at him for honoring what I asked. I want you to be angry at the situation, which was impossible, which was grief wearing the mask of a choice. Your father did not fail me. He was the last faithful act of our marriage. Please let him know that you know that." Reed lowered the letter for a moment. He looked at me. He said, gently, "She left a line here just for you, Harold. Do you want me to keep reading, or would you like a moment?" I shook my head slowly. I said hoarse, "Keep going, please." Reed read the last lines in Eleanor's voice. "Last thing, and then I'll let you all go. Don't spend the time you have left being careful with each other. Careful is not the same as kind. Be kind. Be loud about your love while you still can be. I wasted too many years being careful, and I only wish now that I'd been braver, sooner, with the people I loved most. All my love, always, Eleanor." Reed set the letter down gently. The room was silent except for the rain, and Susan's quiet crying. Susan stepped out into the hallway. She was wiping her face, trying to collect herself. I followed a few steps behind, cautious, unsure if I was welcome. Maddie lingered in the doorway, watching. Susan said, not turning around, "Why didn't you tell me? Any of it. The Cleveland thing. The promotion. Any of it." I said, quiet, honest. "Because your mother asked me not to, at first, and then because I didn't know how to say it without sounding like I was making excuses for myself. I've never been good at that, Susan, explaining myself. Your mother always did the talking in this family. I did the standing next to her." Susan finally turned to face me. Her eyes were red, raw, but there was something new in them, not just grief now, shame, and underneath that, the beginning of understanding. She said, "I said you were dead to me, at the funeral home, in front of everyone." I said, "I remember," she said, voice cracking. I've thought about that sentence every single day for 6 months. I didn't call you enough. I let Maddie be the only one who checked on you, and I let myself believe that was fine, because I was still so angry, and it felt easier than being wrong. I said, gently, you weren't wrong to be angry, Susan. You just aimed it at the wrong thing. That's not a crime. That's just grief finding the nearest door. She let out a shaky breath, half laugh, half sob. She said, that sounds like something Mum would say. I said, small smile. 52 years. Some of it rubs off. A long pause. She took a step closer. She said, I'm sorry, Dad. I don't just mean for what I said at the funeral. I mean for the 6 months after. For not asking you the harder questions. Instead of just deciding, I already knew the answers. I said, voice thick, I'm sorry too. For staying quiet when quiet wasn't what anybody needed. I thought I was protecting you, and your mother's memory both. Turns out, silence doesn't protect much of anything. Just lets the wrong story grow, in the space where the true one should have been. We stood there, neither one closing the distance yet, but the distance itself, smaller than it had been in 6 months. Maddie said, from the doorway gently, you guys want a hug, or should I keep standing here being awkward? A beat. Then Susan let out a real laugh, startled out of her by her daughter's timing, and closed the gap. She wrapped her arms around me. I held her the way I hadn't been allowed to in months, my hand cradling the back of her head the way I did when she was small. Forgiveness rarely arrives all at once, in one clean gesture. It arrives in pieces, an apology here, an old memory there, a hallway hug outside a lawyer's office on a rainy afternoon. It is a decision people make more than once, sometimes for years, before it finally settles into something like peace. 3 weeks later, warm afternoon light. The maple tree Eleanor planted stood full and green. A folding table set up on the lawn, checkered cloth, plates of food, a pitcher of lemonade, Susan arranging napkins, Mark, her husband, flipping something on the grill, Maddie tossing a ball for Biscuit, who chased it with more enthusiasm than grace. I stepped out the back door carrying a bowl of potato salad. I paused. I took in the scene. The first real gathering in my backyard since Eleanor's passing. Susan called over. Dad, come sit. You don't have to do everything yourself. I said, old habits. I set the bowl down and took a seat at the table. Susan sat beside me, not across, beside, a small but deliberate choice. She said, I've been thinking about what Mum said, about not being careful, being kind instead. I said, yeah? She said, I want to come by more, not just Maddie sneaking over and lying to me about where she is. Maddie called out from across the yard. I heard that. Susan shook her head, smiling. She said, I mean it, Dad. Sundays, maybe. We used to do Sunday dinners here when I was a kid. Before things got so busy. Before. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I said, your mother would like that. Sundays. She said, I know she would. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Something that would have felt impossible 6 months ago. I said, quietly, I should have told you about Cleveland myself. A long time before that letter did it for me. I'm sorry it took your mother's handwriting to say what I should have said with my own voice. She took my hand. She said, you're saying it now. I said, better late than never, I suppose. She said, small, genuine smile. That's a very you thing to say. I laughed. A real, unguarded laugh. The kind that hadn't come easily in half a year. The party wound down. I sat alone again in the recliner. But the room felt different now. Warmer. Less like a museum of a life that ended, and more like a house that was, slowly, beginning to live again. On the side table beside me sat a framed photograph, new, recently printed, of me, Susan, Mark and Maddie, all smiling in the backyard that afternoon. Beside it, propped carefully, was Eleanor's letter, folded back into its envelope. I had spent my life running toward fires other people ran from. I had never once considered that the hardest fire I'd ever have to walk into was the quiet distance between myself and the people I loved most. Susan appeared in the doorway. She had stayed behind to help clean up. She leaned against the frame, watching me a moment before I noticed her. She said, "You okay in here?" I said, looking at the photograph, then at her. Getting there. She crossed the room and sat on the arm of Eleanor's old chair, not quite ready to sit in it fully, but closer than she'd been in months. I noticed, said nothing. Let her have the moment in her own time. She said, "Do you think she knew that we'd need the letter this badly?" I said, thoughtful. "Your mother knew most things before the rest of us caught up. I think she hoped we wouldn't need it. But she wrote it anyway, just in case." She said, "I'm glad she did." I said, "Me too." Outside the window, the last light of evening faded